Hey everybody, Matt from 90th percentile.ca here. For access to more study notes, practice questions, mock exams, and end of chapter question videos, visit 90th percentile.ca and sign up for your free trial today. Link below in the description. This learning module is monetary and fiscal policy. Pretty easy to guess what the main two topics are going to be. We got monetary policy and fiscal policy, obviously. Underneath monetary policy, we're going to be discussing the main tools that central banks have at their disposal. One being changing policy rates or interest rates, two being changing reserve requirements at large banks in the country, and then three, open market operations, which is effectively just buying and selling bonds in the market to impact the money supply. And of course, central banks can either engage in expansionary or contractionary monetary policy using these three tools to keep the the health and growth of the economy on the trajectory that it deems acceptable. We're going to touch really briefly on some theories related to monetary policy. So one being the quantity theory of money, the idea of money neutrality, and the Fisher effect. We'll get into those a little bit later. And then when that's done, we'll be talking about fiscal policy as well. In terms of tools at the government's disposal, it's a lot simpler than monetary policy. It's really just, to oversimplify, it's spending and taxes. So spending being money out, taxes being money in. Of course, if they're engaged in expansionary fiscal policy and they're trying to grow the economy, they're going to be spending more than they're taking in terms of revenue, and you're going to have some government deficits and all that. But it's just another party and another institution within a country that has different objectives versus central banks, but the overarching objectives of what they're trying to do is to promote the health of the economy. And we're also going to see towards the end of these questions how fiscal policy and monetary policy interacts and the implications of either having expansionary monetary policy and contractionary fiscal policy, or any combination of those, and what those positions are going to imply for different aspects of the economy. So with that, let's get into the questions. Following exhibit shows the supply and demand for money. So we have money supply here, money demand here. And the question's asking, there is an excess supply of money when the nominal rate of interest is I0, I1, or I2. So we have interest rates along the y-axis and quantity of money along the x-axis. So pretty simple to figure out, where the excess supply is going to be where supply is greater than demand. So we can go interest rate by interest rate just from the top here. And in I1, we have M1 demanded, so this amount money demanded, while we have this amount supplied, which, is the definition of excess supply, because you have supply greater than demand here by this amount. So the answer here is going to be at I1. And the whole idea behind this is when interest rates are higher than the assumed equilibrium, so higher interest rates, with this excess supply of money, investors and people in the market are going to purchase bonds, especially government bonds, which are effectively issued out of nowhere. So they're going to take this excess supply that they have and purchase bonds. And remember that the price and interest rate on bonds, or price and yield on bonds, is inversely related. So if we're purchasing bonds, we're going to increase the price of bonds, which will in turn drive interest rates down. So in the short run, we have this amount of excess supply, but in the long run, with this excess supply, like I said, they'll purchase bonds, which will eventually drive the interest rate back down to equilibrium. We have some questions about the Fisher effect, money neutrality, and the quantity theory of money. First question, the proposition that the real interest rate is relatively stable is most closely associated with Fisher effect, money neutrality, or the quantity theory of money. So quick summary of all three of these concepts. Fisher effect states that real interest rates are constant in an economy, and the nominal rate is the sum of the real interest rate plus expected inflation. So we should be familiar with this already. But the key factor here is that real interest rates remain constant, and then expected inflation, is what drives differences in the nominal rate. So that's going to be A. We can go through the next two as well, even though they're not the answer. Money neutrality is basically says that an increase in the money supply will lead to an increase in prices, which kind of makes sense. Increase in the money supply, you're going to have inflation, prices go up, and GDP is staying the same with this increase in money supply. So that's kind of the neutral aspect of it, where GDP or output stays the same, but just at higher prices. And then finally, the quantity theory of money basically just says that total spending in an economy is proportional to the quantity of money. And it uses this formula with M being quantity of money, V being velocity, so how quickly money is spent, and then P being price, and Y being output. So it equates these two. But like we said, that isn't the answer here. Just thought I would cover it really quickly. And next question, which of the following equations is a consequence of the Fisher effect? So we have some formulas here, pretty easy. We have it written out right here. And we have the nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus the expected rate of inflation. So your answer is A. C or B has it flipped with the real and nominal rate, so you would know that that's incorrect. And then C has a market risk premium, which has nothing to do with the Fisher effect, so that's incorrect as well. When a central bank announces a decrease in its official policy rate, the desired impact is an increase in investment, interbank borrowing rates, or a increase in the national currency's value in exchange for other currencies. So really quickly, there's three main tools that a central bank has in order to either enact expansionary or contractionary monetary policy. One is setting interest rates, so it's policy rate. And you'll see this, commonly done in all central banks, most notable being the Fed, which chooses its Fed funds rate. And essentially their policy rate that they're setting is basically used as a benchmark or like the floor of interest rates in an economy, right? So if the Fed, for example, decreases their rates right here, then the rates that you and I can get for a mortgage, that companies can get for corporate debt, the rates are going to be lower, which means debt is cheaper and companies are more incentivized to borrow. So there's going to be increased lending from the bank's perspective, and all of this will increase the money supply and hopes to, increase economic growth. So this is all expansionary. Second tool that they have is to decrease reserve requirements. So basically, the central bank set a percentage reserve requirement for banks. So like, I don't know, so let's say it's 10%. So banks by law have to have 10% of customers' deposits on hand at any given time in case, customers come in and demand withdrawal of their money, et cetera, et cetera. The lower this reserve requirement is, so let's say it's like 7%, now the bank has to have less of this cash on hand. And what are they going to do with this extra 3%? Are they just going to have it sitting around? No, they're going to lend it out to earn interest, right? So they're going to lend this out in either corporate loans, mortgages, whatever. So in the event that central banks decrease the reserve requirement, once again, it's going to increase lending from the central bank's perspective, which has pretty much the same impact as decreasing rates. Are going to increase money supply, which is going to hopefully increase economic growth. And then the last tool that they have is open market operations. This is basically the central bank buying bonds, sometimes government bonds, because the central bank is technically independent from government, so the central bank can buy government debt. So central bank is effectively printing money out of nowhere to buy these bonds, which injects cash into the economy. And once again, this has the overarching effect of increasing the money supply, which hopes to increase economic growth. One quick thing to note is open market operations is typically done when interest rates are already low. So like the rate that they've set up here, let's say it's, I don't know, 0.5%. They can't set this rate to negative, right? So once you get to this floor close to 0%, they're running out of tools. So this is where central banks, especially in recent history, have started to engage in open market operations where they buy a bunch of bonds. Like if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, like they effectively have a public balance sheet where they show how much debt they have purchased, and you can see the numbers are up there. It's hundreds of billions, trillions. It's just gotten so out of hand recently, but that's a story for another day. Um, yeah, key point is that once they run out of tools and interest rates are really low, don't really have anything else they can do after they've already decreased reserve requirements, the last option they have is to print cash and buy debt. When a central bank announces a decrease in its official policy rate, the desired impact is an increase in investment, interbank borrowing rates, or a increase in the national currency's value in exchange for other currencies. So really quickly, there's three main tools that a central bank has in order to either enact expansionary or contractionary monetary policy. One is setting interest rates, so it's policy rate. And you'll see this, commonly done in all central banks, most notable being the Fed, which chooses its Fed funds rate. And essentially their policy rate that they're setting is basically used as a benchmark or like the floor of interest rates in an economy, right? So if the Fed, for example, decreases their rates right here, then the rates that you and I can get for a mortgage, that companies can get for corporate debt, the rates are going to be lower, which means debt is cheaper and companies are more incentivized to borrow. So there's going to be increased lending from the bank's perspective, and all of this will increase the money supply and hopes to, increase economic growth. So this is all expansionary. Second tool that they have is to decrease reserve requirements. So basically, the central bank set a percentage reserve requirement for banks. So like, I don't know, so let's say it's 10%. So banks by law have to have 10% of customers' deposits on hand at any given time in case, customers come in and demand withdrawal of their money, et cetera, et cetera. The lower this reserve requirement is, so let's say it's like 7%, now the bank has to have less of this cash on hand. And what are they going to do with this extra 3%? Are they just going to have it sitting around? No, they're going to lend it out to earn interest, right? So they're going to lend this out in either corporate loans, mortgages, whatever. So in the event that central banks decrease the reserve requirement, once again, it's going to increase lending from the central bank's perspective, which has pretty much the same impact as decreasing rates are going to increase money supply, which is going to hopefully increase economic growth. And then the last tool that they have is open market operations. This is basically the central bank buying bonds, sometimes government bonds, because the central bank is technically independent from government, so the central bank can buy government debt. So central bank is effectively printing money out of nowhere to buy these bonds, which injects cash into the economy. And once again, this has the overarching effect of increasing the money supply, which hopes to increase economic growth. One quick thing to note is open market operations is typically done when interest rates are already low. So like the rate that they've set up here, let's say it's, I don't know, 0.5%. They can't set this rate to negative, right? So once you get to this floor close to 0%, they're running out of tools. So this is where central banks, especially in recent history, have started to engage in open market operations where they buy a bunch of bonds. Like if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, like they effectively have a public balance sheet where they show how much debt they have purchased, and you can see the numbers are up there. It's hundreds of billions, trillions. It's just gotten so out of hand recently, but that's a story for another day. Yeah, key point is that once they run out of tools and interest rates are really low, don't really have anything else they can do after they've already decreased reserve requirements, the last option they have is to print cash and buy debt. So coming back to the question, When a central bank announces a decrease in its official policy rate, so that was number 2 right here, the desired impact is an increase in investment. We'll get back to it. It's kind of worded a little bit weird. An increase in interbank borrowing rates, yes. So if, like I said, if banks are required to hold less of their cash in deposits, or have less cash on hand to service deposits in the event that customers want to withdraw, then they're going to be lending this cash out. It can either be, I mentioned that they're lending it out to mortgages or businesses, but they can also lend it out to other banks. So this is a desired impact. So now coming back to the question, when a central bank announces a decrease in its official policy rate, so that's number 1 right here, the desired impact is an increase in investment. Well, this is going to be the answer, right? Because we're increasing lending for investment, so businesses can borrow at cheaper debt and increase investment in expansion or growing or whatever. We can go through the rest of the answers anyway. So we're decreasing the policy rate. Will it increase the interbank borrowing rates? No, because the rates that banks lend to each other at are based off of this rate. It's not exactly this rate, but like I said, it uses this rate essentially as a floor. So if we're decreasing the policy rate, interbank borrowing rates would decrease as well. And then the last one, the national currency's value in exchange for other currencies. So it's saying, the value or the FX rate of the national currency. So if we're decreasing rates, and let's say US debt, which once again uses the policy rate as a proxy or a floor. If US debt is yielding I don't know, say the 10-year is yielding 3%, right? Compare that to if it's yielding 5%. If it's yielding 5%, more people, more foreign investors especially, are going to invest when it's 5% versus 3% because you're getting a higher return, right? So if more people are investing in this US debt, that creates a higher demand for the USD currency, which causes it to appreciate. So higher interest rates lead to typically a higher value of the currency for those interest rates. So coming back to the question, once again, we're decreasing rates. Will it increase the currency value? No, it will decrease the currency's value. Which action is a central bank least likely to take if it wants to encourage businesses and households to borrow for investment and consumption purposes? So least likely to expand the economy, which means which one of these, if you're flipping the wording of the question, which one of these is contractionary? Is it selling long-dated government securities, purchasing long-dated government securities, purchasing mortgage bonds or other securities? So kind of went over this in the last question. Whenever they're purchasing, central bank is purchasing debt, they're effectively printing cash out of nowhere to purchase a debt, right? So by purchasing this debt, they are increasing the money supply, which is expansionary, right? This is expected to increase the growth of the economy. So 2 of these options here are purchasing, which are expansionary. So that's not the answer, right? The answer is going to be selling long-dated government securities. So if you're looking at it from the opposite perspective, if they're selling or issuing debt, then investors are going to have to take cash that's already in the economy and purchase this debt, right? So that decreases the money supply and, has the opposite impact as this, where we're expected to decrease economic growth, put a slow on inflation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically the gist of it, you can just look and see that, this one sells, so this is contractionary. One quick note about purchasing long-dated government securities and mortgage bonds. To oversimplify, both of these are expansionary. In recent history, central banks have started purchasing mortgage bonds or other asset-backed securities as well, which is, a little bit new. Typically they would, just buy the government securities. They've started, almost expanding their expansionary monetary policy, if you can like think of it that way, and they're purchasing other types of securities, not just government debt, kind of to diversify, um, but also just to inject cash into other parts of the economy as well. So not only giving the cash effectively to governments, but also giving cash to the securitizers and the people who are creating these asset-backed securities, which has more of a trickle-down effect into different aspects of the economy instead of just the government budget. Which of the following is a limitation on the ability of central banks to stimulate growth in periods of deflation? So, taking a step back, central banks will typically set a inflation target, and they, you know, use their monetary policy tools that we talked about to manage around this inflation target, right? And typically it's, depending on the bank, central bank, it's like 2 or 3%. Um, and their belief is that this sort of inflation range is indicative of a healthy economy that's, growing steadily, but not too crazy where, inflation is like 10, 15, 20, 30%. Um, so if we're looking at a limitation of central banks in a period of deflation, so if deflation, of course, is when inflation is less than 0%, so they're going to want to bump up, you know, expansionary monetary policy to get to this assumed to be healthy target. So what is a limitation? Is it the Ricardian equivalence? No. This is actually related to fiscal policy, and what this says is, so Ricardian basically says that it doesn't matter if governments finance their spending with either increasing taxes or increasing debt. It's basically, just one of those economic theories. Up to you whether or not you think this actually holds in practice. Um, I don't, you know, my 2 cents is it doesn't really make sense that it doesn't matter. Obviously increasing taxes is going to have a different effect on the economy than increasing debt or raising the debt levels. And, like you look at where we are right now with the US looking to increase the debt ceiling once again, and debt has just gone through the roof. So does it matter? I mean, TBD over the next 20 years if this kind of perpetual debt that we've been seeing across global economies really matters. But yeah, just my 2 cents. But anyway, Cardian equivalence has nothing to do with monetary policy. B, the interaction of monetary and fiscal policy. I mean, just reading this doesn't really explain much, right? Like there are some interactions between monetary and fiscal policy, like both can be expansionary at the same time, and that'll have some implications. Both can be contractionary, and that'll, obviously have some implications. You can have one expansionary, one contractionary, but if you're just thinking of central banks themselves, the limitation, I wouldn't really phrase it as being a part of fiscal policy. The answer is going to be the fact that interest rates cannot fall significantly below zero, which once again is what I touched on a little bit earlier, where if interest rates are already at like 0.5% and we have deflation or negative inflation of -5%, there's not much more they can do from decreasing rates in order to promote growth. They're going to have to engage in open market operations. Now we're moving on to fiscal policy, and with the least likely goal of fiscal policy is to do what? Well, the main three goals of fiscal policy are: one, to increase aggregate demand or GDP or output. Two is to redistribute wealth. So this could be done through changing tax rates, decreasing tax rates for lower income people, increasing tax rates for higher income people, stuff like that. And the last one is allocation of resources. So, the government obviously chooses where to invest its money. Could be into healthcare, military, could be, subsidies for different industries. So like, clean energy is one that's gotten a lot of funding, especially in the US recently, like, electric cars, all that. Um, so coming back to the question, the least likely goal is to redistribute income and wealth. Nope. Influence aggregate national output. Nope. Ensure stability of purchasing power of its currency. Purchasing power is related to inflation, and this is a monetary policy or central bank objective to manage inflation. So this is your answer. Which of the following best represents contractionary fiscal policy? Public spending on a high-speed railway, a temporary suspension of payroll taxes, or a freeze in discretionary government spending. So the main two tools related to fiscal policy are a lot simpler than monetary policy. We have spending, which is, outflows. This could be spending on infrastructure, spending on different industries, spending on whatever. And then we have taxes. So these are their inflows. So in order to engage in contractionary fiscal policy, they would be decreasing spending, so decreasing investment in, highways, healthcare, whatever, and increasing taxes, which leaves less money in the economy. So if we're coming back to the answers here, if we're looking for contractionary fiscal policy, it's not public spending, because that's, investing and expanding the economy. A temporary suspension of payroll taxes, nope. Decreasing taxes would be expansionary. A freeze in discretionary government spending, that's exactly it. So they're not spending anymore, they're not investing. So it's expected to slow down the growth of the economy. Which statement regarding fiscal policy is most accurate? To raise business capital spending, personal income taxes should be reduced. Nope. This is, it's almost two separate things where we have corporate tax, and personal tax. So decreasing corporate tax, will incentivize businesses to invest more. They get to keep a lot more of their profits, so they can either, hire more, or they can reinvest the money that they're saving on taxes. So there's kind of, an indirect relationship between the impacts of corporate tax and personal tax. Like I said, if you're decreasing corporate tax, you could get more people hired, you could increase employment levels, and then like reinvesting also has a trickle down effects through the economy. But personal tax should be thought of, separate, where if they're decreasing personal tax, this gives businesses or people more money to spend, so it'll increase spending, and that could be on, any aspect of the economy. So if you're increasing spending on, it could be something related to a corporation, like if a corp is a real estate developer, then you're going to increase spending on houses because you have more purchasing power. You can also be spending more on luxury goods, etc. Like it depends what this corporation is. Um, but there, like I said, there's kind of an indirect relationship between the two. So decreasing personal income taxes won't necessarily um, raise business investment. Going on to B, cyclically adjusted budget deficits are appropriate indicators of fiscal policy. This is true. And the whole concept behind this is that, the government will set their budget every quarter, every year, every whatever, and they outline what they're spending all their money on different aspects of the economy, and they should reevaluate these deficits. And deficit, of course, when you're spending more than what you're taking in. So they should reevaluate these budget deficits on a timely basis. So, keeping up to date with what's going on in the economy shouldn't, the economy's slowing down. You might have to readjust where you're allocating all your money if the government isn't taking as much money in forms of taxes, right? And then finally, an increase in the budget surplus associated with expansionary fiscal policy. In expansionary fiscal policy, the budget deficit would increase, not the surplus. It's a surplus, they're taking in more money than they're spending, and if they're spending more then they're taken in, which is expansionary, then their deficit is going to increase, not their surplus. Now we're starting to get into comparisons between monetary and fiscal policy and how they interact with each other. So given an independent central bank, monetary policy actions are more likely than fiscal policy actions to be implementable quickly, effective when a specific group is targeted, or effective when combating a deflationary economy. Answer is going to be A. Um, if you were to think about it, monetary policy, so like various tools that they have, such as changing interest rates, those are implemented pretty much immediately. Like the central bank announces a new interest rate target and it takes effect immediately, versus let's say like a government spending bill in the event of expansionary fiscal policy. Just think about how much they have to go through to actually get that bill passed. All the different hurdles that they have to go through, and it takes forever. Once again, the U.S. over the last couple of years has been a good example of that with the big infrastructure bill, which took forever. I don't even know where it ended up, if I'm being honest, but you know, took a lot longer than the central bank just saying, okay, interest rate 0.25%, boom, done. Last question here, which policy alternative is most likely to be effective for growing both public and private sector? So growing is expansionary in the public and private sector. So the way to think of it, monetary policy for the most part um, impacts the private sector. So, decrease in interest rates gives individual corporations and, corporate America more money to expand, more, cheaper debt. So the monetary policy is more corporations, which is a private sector, and the fiscal policy is government. So of course that's the public sector. So if you were to look at these combinations, we can see the impact that each combination will have on the private and public sector. So if you look at A, easy fiscal and easy monetary policy, easy is another synonym for expansionary. So if we have easy fiscal, public sector spending is going to grow, and private sector spending is also going to grow. So our answer is going to be A, but we can go through the rest of the list. We have easy fiscal in B. Easy fiscal will increase public sector, and tight monetary will decrease private sector. So in this case, actually the public sector percentage of spending or percentage of the economy will increase because public sector is increasing, private is decreasing, so the percentage for public is going to represent a higher percentage of the total. But that's not our answer. We wanted it to grow both public and private. And then the last one, tight or contractionary fiscal and monetary policy. Of course, that's not the answer, because but decrease both private and public sector spending.